Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. And what is that Lee Spiegel always says? I'm from an undisclosed location somewhere on the East Coast. I'm not at home in my home studio, but I am in a nice home with a friendly fan of the show, may I say. I can say that, right? They heard about me or something. I'm not really sure. But anyway, welcome to the show, everyone. Our guests tonight are both Frank Feschino and Alfred Lehmberg, and it should be a fun and interesting show. The FLATWOODS monster case. I heard about this right off the bat, and I remember when I first started looking into UFOs, and I remember thinking that is such an oddball looking creature. There's got to be something to it. I mean, that's kind of my attitude. Like, it's just too bizarre. Why would someone not put like a gray alien or something, in its place? It's so fantastic what they saw and all that, and what happened before and the fallout after. So we'll be talking about all of that. Over at our website, podcastufo.com, we have a blog, as we do every week, that actually goes into an audio blog later from Charles Lear. And this week is UFOs and electromagnetism. And that's a lot of the stalled car cases. I know of one actually was told firsthand that it happened to someone that I know. When a UFO went over, the cars just completely stopped. Whether it's electromagnetism or there's been some research on that, what makes cars stop and then restart. But it's happened in numerous cases. So it's a great blog. Check that out over there. And I do want to thank everyone that helps out with the show. Anyone can do that. And that, again, is over at our website. You can see the support the show link for only $2 or more a month. I appreciate every listener. I'm glad you come here every week. And I'm glad to be on all the different platforms. We're on YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, on KGRA radio. And then, of course, it comes out as a podcast. And anyone can get that podcast feed. It's on our website. You can put it in your media player and listen to full episodes for free. For the people that support the show, I don't really announce this much, but I do have a lot of shows that you weren't able to get to a 5-year stretch, that I do have those available that I can send. I can send like a clip or two. Some people say, I want all of them, so it's not so easy, but I'd be glad to send you if you do support the show and you want to listen to old archives, that is available. And without further ado, I can't think of anything else to talk about. I'm going to bring in my two guests. Here is Frank. Neither one of them are on camera. It's just they're remarkably handsome, so they didn't want to, they wanted people to pay attention to the show. That's why. Right, guys? Can you hear me?
Glad to be on board. I do, Martin. I help.
Hey, how you all doing? And I'm not that good looking.
Well, you play good music, and this is a treat. At the top of the hour, we go into our regular break, and we're going to play a musical piece by Alfred. He did a wonderful piece. But we're here to talk about the FLATWOODS monster. It's an incredible case. But before we get into that, Frank, I believe you were on my show a Christmas Eve, I think it was, wasn't it? Years ago?
Quite a few years ago. Nobody else wanted to do the show, and I was the only one willing to come on Christmas Eve.
That's right. Yeah, everyone backed out.
Show.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But that was years ago. Was it 2015 or something like that? I can't even remember. It was a long time ago.
Years ago.
Yeah.
And Ed called me up, and he gave me the heads up on it, and I got in contact with you.
Yeah, right.
A lot of stuff happened since then, so we got a lot to talk about tonight. And we got Alfred Lehmberg with us tonight. And Alfred's one of the few writers / researchers who's actually been up in FLATWOODS with me for quite a few years. How many years you been going up there with me, Alfred? 8, 9, 10, something like that. I lost track.
I think every part of this century.
This century, I love it. So I want to get into, how you gained this interest. I'll start with you, Frank. Why the FLATWOODS monster case? And did you have an interest in UFOs ahead of that, or is this something that got you interested in UFOs?
Not too much of an interest, just a little bit in growing up as a kid, reading some of the books and seeing stuff in, periodicals and whatever, but nothing hardcore. But it's when I went up to West Virginia in 1991, I have relatives in Frametown and in Flatwoods, and that's how I found out about the case. But my first interest came on my cousin, Dave, who since passed away a few years ago. He was having crop circles up here in these big giant rings. He had a 400-acre cattle ranch. It was a big giant farm, and he had all of these rings, hundreds of them appearing all over his property. So I went up there and I checked it out. And back in the day, I had access. There was only one or two people I know that actually had video cameras. And I borrowed a video camera for a weekend. I went up there and I got some nice footage. Then I took some photographs and some soil samples of these big gigantic rings on Cousin Dave's property. And this is when I lived in Connecticut. And when I went back home to Connecticut, I spoke to a friend, and he was a member of the MUFON in Connecticut, and he hooked me up with the organization up there, MUFON Connecticut, and I showed them some of my research. And it right about at that time in later 1991, Colin Andrews called me up from England, and he was on his way over to Connecticut, and I met him just outside of New Haven. And I brought all of my documentation and samples and everything, and I basically gave it to him. And it was a couple of years later, I got a call from Colin, and the same exact rings that appeared in West Virginia in Frametown actually appeared in England a couple of years later. So that was kind of fascinating, thousands of miles apart. So that's why Colin keeps all of that, everything in that database.
Well, I don't want to take too much of a jag from tonight's topic, but I do want to continue just a little bit. Let's talk about your cousin's farm. Is it an isolated situation? It was the first and only time that happened? And was there ever a possibility that someone actually did this? Or, you know how they always say a lot of the crop circles are man-made? And I just wonder what was the conclusion on this one in particular.
It was actually ongoing for years. And it got to a point, the first couple of years I was in Connecticut, then I moved down to Daytona Beach, Florida, and they were going on for years, and all of these sightings. And you have to imagine what it's like. His property was one of the highest points in central West Virginia in that Frametown area, which we'll talk about later, where the Frametown Monster incident happened. But there had been records going back for years. And you don't walk onto people's properties up there and make 60, 80, and 100-foot rings on their property. You get shot. You just don't pass. I learned that out the hard way. But I have video footage of flying saucers and still photographs up there in the early years when I was going up there. And it got to a point where my buddies and friends and family members would even travel with me, and we would go up there and we would watch them. It was like watching a show in the sky. And I remember the first time I saw them, I went, son of a gun, look at this. The government's telling us there's no such things as flying saucers, and here's 8 of us sitting on Lookout Hill on the eastern part of the property watching them put on an aerial display at close range. And we did this for years. We were just going up there watching them. And
is it still a hot spot as far as you know? Like, would you call it that?
Say that again, please.
Would you call that a hot spot? I mean, are things ongoing there? Do you have any idea?
Oh,
I know you don't live there now.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot spot. There's been stuff going on there for years. There was a famous case that was broadcast, I believe it was on Fox back around 1989-90 of an incident that happened there. But the thing is, the people were scared to talk about this stuff. And one of the reasons was because of the FLATWOODS Monster Incident. And they just, the public made fools out of those people. And it's all these years and generations later, they're still basically quiet unless, somebody comes forward like myself. And we become the forward leaders for these people. It's like when I was on my first book tour up there in 2004, my first edition book came out. Stanton Friedman told me, he says, Frank, when you do these, your first book tours, you're going to see what it's like. And don't get too nervous when you see people standing around and waiting for you all over the room or in the hallway. He says, because they're going to wait till you leave. And then they're going to come over and they're going to tell you what happened. And that
That's
happened.
exactly right. Yeah.
Up there for months. Yeah, I talked to hundreds of people. And it was amazing. The whole state of West Virginia.
Now, I do. I want to hear from Alfred next, but I do want to say that we do get a lot of new people here, and a lot of people are totally unaware of what we're talking about when it comes to the Flatwood Monster. So I'm going to want a detail of that. But for right now, I'd like to hear from you. Whoops, sorry about that. I want to hear from you, if I could, Alfred. What got your interest perked in this UFO topic?
Well, yeah, that's a long story in the first place, and hardly even worth going into. But I can tell you that I retired from the Army in 1992, and almost immediately went back to college. And after a couple of years of college, I was going from one spot on the campus to the other spot on a route that I would ordinarily never take, and I just happened to see a billboard up with Robert Hastings was giving a lecture, and I thought, I looked at that, and all of a sudden I was flashed back to about 1955 in Connecticut, where I also grew up, and there was a big flap at that time, and people were seeing UFOs and whatnot. And I just put two and two together. And I even had to cut a class that I enjoyed to go see Robert Hastings talk. And from that point on, I was in 100%, all in.
Well, I get that. I mean, the whole thing with nukes and UFOs is a fascinating thing. And I was just telling a friend the other day, Stanton Friedman used to say, the reason that UFOs showed up in 1947 is because they said the kids found the matches. In other words, whoever it is that comes to observe and mess with nuclear warheads and things like that, shut them down. Those incredible cases. Maybe the reason they're here is because, we could blow ourselves up. And I don't know. But I have talked to Robert about that in the past, and he more or less agrees with that.
Yeah, maybe it's not warp technology that brings ET, but nuclear weapons.
Right, exactly. So let's see. I guess I would ask you, Frank, because you're so well versed in the case, if you would discuss for the person that has never heard of the Flatwoods Monster case, what happened in September 12th, 1952, and a very busy year.
Yeah, well, first of all, the Summer of the Saucers, which Alfred and I call that, they had Project Blue Book had the most sightings during that period. And Flatwoods was right at the end of the summer. And it was one of the top 10 biggest news stories in the world. And it was said that 10 to 12 foot tall alien, which they nicknamed the Monster, was seen on a farm after a crash landed in central West Virginia. Now, Flatwoods is a geographical center of the state. And if you look on a map, it's dead center. And if you go a little over 200 miles to the east, that's where Washington, D.C. is, the capital. And that will come into play later. But there was a lot of UFOs seen over West Virginia and throughout the eastern seaboard that night. But it was very sporadic coverage. Ivan T. Sanderson wrote in his book Uninvited Visitors a little bit about it. But he didn't have the luxury of having the Project Blue Book case file on Flatwoods. I got hold of the file, and I spent 5 years going over just approximately about 100 pages of notes. And it took me years just to go through and scribe over the faded ink, because it was copy after copy after copy. So I spent years putting all this together. and I used my master map, which you could see on my website. And I basically, over the years, I kept pinpointing locations where UFOs were seen. And I knew every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Everybody focused on Flatwoods. Sanderson had a little bit going on in the Baltimore area and the Washington area, but he couldn't put it together. The newspaper coverage didn't have a fraction of what was in Blue Book. And nobody had ever looked at Blue Book. So what I did is I got all the writer's information. Gray Barker, who was one of the original investigators. He was from West Virginia. And Sanderson's notes. And I put everything together with all the magazine periodicals I could find, all the books, everything on planet Earth, every article I could find for years of traveling. And I put all of this stuff together, and I made timelines. And Flatwoods was actually the end of the story. And I was able to come up with flight paths throughout the United States. And I have over 100 locations I pinpointed where several different UFOs were seen that night. And this thing crashed on a farm, and it was seen by a bunch of local kids playing football, pickup football on a Friday night. It was September 12th, 52. And it was an Indian summer, so it was still warm. And you have to put yourself into 1952. Flatwoods is kind of like Mayberry, RFD, that kind of setting, quiet, sleepy little town, except about 10 years further back than when that thing was shot, the Mayberry. And these kids saw this thing flying over a treetop level, cut across the road, and it landed up on top of the farm. And a bunch of these boys went up to go investigate to see what happened. So that's kind of setting the stage, bringing us to Flatwoods of what actually happened. And nobody else had ever pieced together. Everybody focused on Flatwoods, that one little town. And that's where 99% of the reporting was right there. And I knew there was more stuff going on. And there was stuff going on north, south, east, and west. It was an omni effect. And that turned into 20 to 25 years of research to figure this out. And every time I came out with another book or did another radio show, people would contact me, send me new articles. And it was like, oh, my God, my book would be updated 20 times in the past few years. So I just keep putting everything up on the internet and links and putting the updates on my website.
But that brings us to the elephant in the room, doesn't it?
Go ahead, Alfred.
Well, consider, already addressed, the summer of saucers. UFOs are everywhere. They are hazarding aircraft. Credible people are seeing them on the ground. Next thing you know, they're impinging on prohibited airspace, and the United States military gets concerned and publishes orders to shoot them down where they are encountered. And there'll be some other little blurb about, if they don't take directions to land and whatnot, but that's just lawyer talk. Thing is, one of these things crashed in Flatwoods. So what Frank is doing, and we come to the elephant in the room, what Frank has done is make a real good case for undeclared air war with ET in 1952.
Is this your own thoughts, Alfred, or is this something you've written about in the past or talked about with other people?
Oh, I've done a lot of talking and a lot of writing, but all of this is drawn directly from, again, that very good case that Frank makes for ET war.
Basically,
I've never heard that spin on it, but
anything about the Flatwoods case until they talked to me. I met Stanton and Gulf Breeze, in the early 90s at a conference. And when I was talking to him and told him I was doing, the first thing Stanton Friedman, he turned around and looked at me dead in the eyes. He says, how the hell did you get up there in those mountains? And I remember him saying that. He said, we've been trying to get up there for years. I said, who's we? He said, the UFO investigators and researchers. And I laughed. I says, well, I got family up there, so I was a couple steps ahead. And that's basically why I was able to go through those mountains up there.
And we need to add here too that seriously that Stanton Friedman was documented as being very impressed with one Frank C. Feschino.
Yeah. How about that? So as far as you haven't really talked too much about the reason of the being whatever it was. I know they went up the hill. Now, didn't they like run home first and get a mother or something like that? And they all went up on the hill with a flashlight or something. Am I getting that wrong?
In the group were the May brothers, Eddie May and Freddie May, and they ran to the house of their house, and Kathleen May owned it, and that was at the little access road that went up to the back farm. That's the reason they stopped there. A bunch of kids chickened out, and they ran home because they were scared, and Kathleen and her older cousin Jean Lemon, who was about 18, they went with the group of kids up onto the farm, and that's when they had the encounter about half an hour later.
Oh, I see. Half an hour later.
They all saw this thing fly over. And I've talked to people over the years who are since passed away, and they said, boy, that was probably the biggest mistake of my life. They were there and they chickened out and went home. I said, well, maybe not so.
Yeah. And so when they actually saw what of course, you know the stories of people trying to say it was an owl in a tree. I think even the Project Blue Book series that was on TV portrayed something like that, didn't they? Or I can't remember how they did that.
That was actually Major Donald Keel, who was a pioneer researcher back from the late 40s into the 50s. He wrote about the Flatwoods case, and he actually contacted the public liaison, Albert Chop, and Chop spoke to Keel with length, and he gave the description and the explanation of what it was. But it was nothing solid. He said it probably was an owl in the tree, and underbrush may have given the impression of a giant monster, and the landing site could have been caused by the villagers as they were running around in circles. It was really absurd. But the airport did cover this thing up really big, and they went in undercover, and Kathleen May, who was a primary witness, she was the closest one to the monster. She told me she was the length of a small car to it. And I work with Kathleen extensively, and I want your listeners to know when I wrote this book over the course of all these years, and I work with the witnesses, Martin, it wasn't like, oh, I talked to Kathleen once. I talked to her hundreds and hundreds of times. I was calling her on the phone. I wore a path out to West Virginia from Connecticut into Florida, going to her home and sitting down and spending days with her and sitting and then talking about it. And she was telling me of what happened. And then I showed her what really opened the whole story up is when I plopped over a pound of Project Blue Book notes for September 12th down on the table. And that's when she almost fell out of her chair. She says, and they made fun of us all of these years, and here it is. I said, here, Kathleen, look at it. And it was about 100 pages or so.
For that one night? For the one night?
Yep, just one night.
That's amazing. But it had to do a lot.
Followed up.
Kind of.
We looked into it.
Yeah. And so as far as people investigating it, did you say it was actually Kehoe that actually went there?
No, Kehoe didn't go there. Ivan Sanderson did. But
Sanderson,
the original investigator. And he kind of had a lot of people looked at him like a goofball at the beginning with the things that he did and some of the writings. But I'll tell you, honest to God, what Stanton Friedman said to me when he read my original manuscript, he called me up from Canada and he said, Frank, I have a whole new different slant on Gray Barker. He says, a lot of people looked at him as a clown. He says, but he really busted his butt. running around up in those mountains, and he got a lot of key information that would have been overlooked. And I said, you're right, Stan. He was basically the nut of the story. And then when Sanderson came in about a week later, he didn't talk to all the witnesses because Kathleen May and Ailey Stewart had went to New York to be on the talk show, We the People. So he basically talked to the little kids who saw the monster, and he's the one who got the majority of the drawings, where you see the little kids' drawings with the ace of spades covering over the head, and he did all of that.
Yeah, so let's talk again for the person that's never heard this story. I don't know, either one of you, if you want to describe what the general consensus of this creature and the size of it and everything.
You want to run with it, Al, for a second?
Yeah, we need to hear more, Al.
What, more Al? Oh,
Yeah.
no. Well, the thing of it is, again, this is the end of the story. It's the period. It's the punctuation, and then we all go out for snacks. But we've got some legitimately intelligent, forthright, and credible people who encountered this thing flying over their heads, and Frank will correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it was in some distress. It was a ball of fire. It was flying. What is erratic when you're looking?
Pieces falling off of it. It was exploding. When it came across the eastern seaboard, it passed over Washington, D.C., flew a little over 200 miles westward. It was blowing up, burning treetops. It flew all the way into the area of Burnsville, and then it headed south, and it followed the main road there, State Route 4. And it headed south, and that's when it passed over the kids who saw it on the playground, and then it cut back, and it went over, and it landed. But the biggest misconception about the monster, which Alfred and I have talked about this at length, was the ridiculous drawing and the portrayal of it. Mrs. May went to New York, and the staff artist for We the People sat down, and they talked to Kathleen May and Gene Lemon, the oldest boy who saw the monster. And they were given their descriptions of what this thing looked like. And from talking with Kathleen and working with all the witnesses, this thing was actually a mechanical device. When Mrs. May was trying to describe what this thing looked like, now you have to try and put yourself back in 1952, a bunch of people who live on a farm. They see this metallic structure 12 foot tall that's hovering, that looks like a booster rocket. And it's flared out towards the bottom. The head is an ace of spades, which was actually a giant covering. It was a helmet, and it had what looked like a plate glass window. Freddie May, Kathleen's younger boy who saw it, he said it reminded him of looking in the cockpit of a fighter jet. The outer shell was actually the canopy that you can see through, and the fighter pilot's inside with his gear and his helmet on. That's what this Flatwoods monster was. It was actually something inside of a spacesuit. So Kathleen was never able to get up there with me, because you got to be, somewhat of a climber, a mountain climber, to get up there. But I went up with Freddie May after interviewing his mother for years. And he took me step by step by step by step, right from the school playground all the way up to the location where it was seen. And I did sketches and drawings with Freddie. I had talked to his brother as well, but Freddie and Kathleen were the primary ones that I worked with. And I talked to a bunch of the other witnesses, but going to West Virginia so often, I was able to sit down with them. And being an illustrator, and I specialize in portrait art, I went to Parra College of Art. I sat down and did police style renderings. And I don't think anybody else would have been able to do it, because I sat down for hours and said, well, Mrs. May, did it look like this? And she said, no, it was more flared out here. It was metallic. What she to describe, we there?
Yeah, keep going.
Okay, there was a drop out there.
I know, I heard that, but that's okay. Yeah.
Lower portion of it, where it was flared out, were actually pipes and they looked like small tubes. Freddie May held his arm out in front of him when we were doing the drawings, and he said they were about as thick as my arm, my forearm, like a fireman's hose. And they went around the whole lower circumference. And when Mrs. May was trying to describe this to the television artist, she likened it to the rolls of the pleats in her curtains. You know how the drapes hang down? So what the artist did is he took it literally. Instead of drawing pipes, and he drew it in a dress. And he has these drapes hanging down. And then Mrs. May and Freddie and a couple of the other witnesses also told me that they were like antenna type devices that came off of the shoulders, and the helmet was black, and it had a plate glass window in front of it, and the actually there was no face. It was like a red helmet. And Freddie stood on the site exactly where he was, and he said that the eyeballs weren't eyeballs as they were portrayed as bulging eyeballs, how the press had hyped it up. He said they were actually holes, like portholes, like if you were standing across the street and looking in your neighbor's windows, you could see the warm light of the yellow. And he said inside it was like a greenish orange. And Freddie saw it back, the monster, back a few feet, and Kathleen May saw it up front. So what was great when I was doing my illustrations, Freddie saw the whole thing unfold in front of him. He was towards the end of the pack. His mother was up front. And when they came around the swag, she was with Gene Lemon, and this thing had lifted up and hovered off the ground and started coming around the tree. And when they saw it, they flashed their flashlight at it, and the thing lit up. Kathleen said like a Christmas tree. Well, it passed in front of them, and it was actually hovering. The one thing the sketch artist got correct, as you can see in the original 1952 drawing, there's a drop cast shadow underneath the figure, which actually illustrates the thing was elevated above the ground. And Kathleen said it was about 1.5 feet off of the ground. And it was blowing the debris and, you know, the rocks and all the crap that was sitting on the path there. And it actually was going back towards its craft. It didn't make any hostile moves, but it passed in front of them. And when it passed in front of Gene Lemon, it scared the hell out of him. And Kathleen said she looked over and saw Gene, and his legs got rubbery. He just was freaked out, and he basically momentary lapse, and he keeled over, and he got back up, and the kids just ran all back down the hill, and they went to the house. And that's basically what happened during the encounter. But everything was all botched up. And when with the descriptions, so I dug back a little bit deeper, and I found out that Ailey Stewart, who was the newspaper writer for the Braxton County Democrat, he was the Johnny on the spot. Well, in the mid-90s, I tracked Stewart down, and he hadn't done an interview since 1952. His newspaper, which was in Sutton, which is the county seat, was basically the headquarters, because people were coming from all over the country. They were coming from all over the world. This story hit really big within about a week. And what happened is Ailey Stewart was kind of like the commander of everything. He was, you know, when everybody would come in, his office there at the Democrat was basically the hub. So when I interviewed him, he filled me in on the rest of the story and told me a lot of stuff that never hit the press. But anyway, the whole point I was getting at is he wrote the absolute definitive article, and it was published in the Charleston Gazette, I believe it was. I have over 100 articles here, but he described it as a mechanical man, as being told by the witnesses. It looked like a mechanical man. And it had a cowl over its head with small antenna-like arm devices coming off of it, and hovered. And he gave a description of it. And what happened after that is when it hit the United Press and it shotgun around the world, that's when the story got distorted.
I see. You know, when
I
this
came out with my original drawings, everybody's like, you're crazy. You know, all of a sudden it looks like a robot from a 50 science fiction movie. And I'm like, no, that's the way it did look. It was the press that botched it up. And then I have the old article that talks about Stewart, and Stewart verified. He says, yeah, Frank, he says, I was the first one there. And after that, the press ran and screwed it up.
Yeah.
And that's why all of those years, everybody thought it looked like a monster in a dress.
You know, it's funny when I have, you know, contemplated, like when people talk about seeing an extraterrestrial, they think is an extraterrestrial, you know, without a spacesuit, without any protection from, you know, you think of, you know, we're still in this pandemic. You think about things like that. You think about the Europeans when they came to from Spain to Mexico and to also here, how many people are wiped out from unknown or you know, their body is not immune to these things. So I always thought, how could these things like walk around and breathe our air if that's what's going on? So the spacesuit, it to me makes sense, but the thing it's the first time. I don't remember talking about this when you were on the show, but it was quite a while ago. But when this thing, this robot or whatever it was, did anybody see it head back to the craft and the craft take off? Was that any part of the story in any way?
When the thing went by the witnesses, they all hightailed it and got out. They were freaked out. Yeah. They saw it move down towards the slope of the farm. What the thing had done is it landed at the far back of the farm, and it was at the highest plateau. It relocated. By the time the kids saw it go down there, it relocated into the gully of the farm, and there was a pear orchard back there, and the thing settled in kind of like incognito amongst the trees, and it sat off to the side in this sloping giant valley that's like the size of a football field. So what happened when they went back up to investigate, when Stewart went back up there the next day, where this thing had relocated, it left a circular pattern in the grass, and there was a path that came up from the area of where the thing had touched down. It came up the inclination, it went across the path, and it went up to the tree. Now this thing was over 4 foot wide at the base, and it had a propulsion system. So what it did is basically blew the foot and a half tall grass and all the sediment and the leaves and everything that was laying around in that path, it blew it apart. So it cut a path going up. When it left, it followed a parallel path. And that's what Stewart saw, the reporter, when he went up the next day. So basically it followed his footprint back out. There were people that did see it leave. Mrs. May and the boys didn't see it leave. You know, they never looked back after they saw this thing. And but there is records, and it's in my book. There were some people that did see it leave.
Did anyone see any type of
article real quick? Let me just read this to you before we get off track. This will kind of set the pace of what we're getting at. This was the story that was special to the Charleston Gazette, and this was Ailey Stewart, who spoke to them and wrote this article. It wore a suit of green armor, looked like a mechanical man, was 10 feet tall, 4 foot wide, had a blood red face, and sported a black spade-like cowl which extended a foot or more above its head, and it had claw-like toy hands. The hands were actually what Freddie told me. He said they look like some type of antenna devices. So that is actually on the 15th of September 1952. Everybody overlooked that. Everybody looked at the articles that came out later at the United Press. And in the meantime, they released that stupid drawing of what the monster looked like, and everybody forgot what it really looked like.
That's really interesting. What about when they went to investigate? Did they find any type of trace evidence for you mentioned about the things being blown around, but what about where the craft supposedly I guess, crash landed. Would you say that?
Yeah, that it touched down on the far back farm, and then it relocated into another area. And what was interesting, and I remember when Stanton was up there for one of the anniversaries, we walked around the farm. What he was amazed at is this thing was seen on fire, but when it touched down, there were no burn marks. And I also interviewed colonel from the United States Army who went up to the crash site. He was a captain at the time, Colonel Dale Levitt, and he told me the same thing, because everybody said this thing was on fire, but it was odd when it touched down, it was cool. And Levitt told me during our interview, he says, no, nothing was burned, but there were pieces of a black plastic like material, a hard plastic that was strewn around the farm, and there was oil. This thing was leaking, and where it sat behind the tree, Levitt told me there was a puddle of it. And when the thing lifted up, and Mrs. May and Lemon, they basically simultaneously flashed their flashlights. They saw the eyes glowing at the edge of the woods. And when they hit this, the beam hit it, it lit up. It had hovered. It came in front of them. Now, Levitt, when he went up with his troops that night, he told me that all the oil was puddled around right by the tree, and him and his troops gathered it all up, and there were pieces of this plastic stuff. Now, Kathleen also told me when this thing hovered towards the field and across her path, went from her left to right across, it was spewing this oil. It was like a grayish type oil, and it splattered and hit her in the face because she was the closest one, and it hit the front of her. She had a suit on. Back in the day, she was a hairdresser, and she had this hat, and it splattered across the front of her, and it hit some of the boys, and the smell was like a sulfur type smell, and the kids were inhaling this, and some of them were actually throwing up all night from inhaling this sulfur. Freddie told me it smelled like that rancid smell of the old TV tubes burning out.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, that's what he said it smelled like, but basically sulfur. And out in the distance, the whole point, the whole time this was going on, Freddie told me he didn't see the craft. He said he was focused on the left walking up the hill, and the bushes and the shrubs were a little bit higher, but he told me he heard this constant whining noise. And I have a little documentary I put together, about 40 minutes, on YouTube. If you just put up Braxton County Monster Feschino, you'll watch it. And Freddie stood there on site, and he waved his arm around in a circular motion. And he said, I heard this whining down noise, like it was slowing down and then speeding up and down. Well, he said he didn't realize what this thing was. And when he years later, he worked at Union Carbide in Charleston. He said the first day that they shut those big massive generators down, he said that was basically the same sound that he heard, and the hair stood up on his back. So it was some type of a generator he heard out in the field, and that's where the craft was.
And what about the oil and the hard plastic? Was that research?
Levitt grabbed all the stuff up, and he grabbed all the oil, and he told me he shifted it off to Washington. When I spoke to Kathleen, I asked her what happened to the stuff that hit your uniform, and she told me a couple guys, and now I devote like basically a whole chapter to this. The intelligence went up there, and they posed as newspaper reporters. And they were trying to get Kathleen to talk, and they kind of ticked her off because they were very adamant, and she was just getting fed up. She got hundreds of phone calls. People were trying to interview her from all over, and Flatwoods was basically trampled for weeks. And she said these guys finally, to get her to talk, finally admitted they were from Washington. And the whole story's in the book, but long story short, She told me they were up on the farm in the back where all of this happened. She gave them the lowdown on what went on. She says, we went back to the house and they took a special tool out and they scraped all the oil out of her uniform and the hat that she had on. And
I'm surprised they didn't just take it.
Yeah, well, I asked her, I said, why didn't they just take the thing, Kathleen? She says all they did was kind of scrape the oil out because it was her work uniform. And I says, what did you do with your uniform? I like, you know, 1,000,000 to 1 chance. Maybe she had it laying around the house. And she said, Frank, she said it was stained and I held it for a few years and I eventually threw it out. And I remember her saying, I never would have got that stain out anyways. It was that bad.
Yeah, I do remember.
Chucked it away. It was pieces of metal that were found on the farm, and Ailey Stewart, the reporter, found them the next day. And I write a part of a chapter about that, and his stuff was confiscated too by people from Washington. They stole it out of his house. He was getting ready to bring this stuff on a national TV show in New York. And shortly before, they had come into his house and they took it. And Lee, you know, did a little drawing of what it looked like. And he said that his father and some of the people in town said, you better keep your goddamn mouth shut, Lee, because you got this metal from this thing out there from the crash site. And people are going to find out and they're going to talk. Well, guess what? That's what happened. And people came in from Washington, but that's a whole story in itself. But that was confiscated as well. So this was a well-organized covert operation to get all of this stuff before Kathleen, Ailey Stewart, and Gene Lemon went on national TV. Can you imagine on a live audience, all of them holding all this material up? So the government's been doing this for a long time. They had all their ducks in a row. They knew what the hell they were doing. They got all of this stuff.
Interesting. Alfred, we haven't heard from you in a while. Is this anything that you've also looked into?
As far as looking into it from a research standpoint, no. All I can report is that I've gone to these sites. I've talked to many of the people and found them credible. And something I have to point out too is that you might think it was just a bunch of hillbillies up there in the woods who don't know any better, and that's kind of what you're going to get from your run of the mill skeptebunky. But these kids that were witnesses to this thing, each of them drew pictures under an arduous interrogation. I mean, a real mean guy interrogation from Ailey Stewart. And they all reported the same thing. They all drew the same thing. Something certainly occurred up there.
Right. Now, I do remember hearing about this case, and one of the first things that is mentioned is there's a foul smell. Was it this sulfur smell, the same one you mentioned, Frank?
Sulfur smell. And when Kathleen and the boys were going up the path, it was like a low-lying rolling fog was coming from the area of the tree. And as they got closer to it, it was actually the propulsion system. It was shooting out of the bottom because this thing was hovering. And as they got closer to this thing, the whole area was starting to become engulfed. And then when they flashed the flashlight at the eyes, that's when the thing lit up and lifted off the ground. But Kathleen was close enough to it where she gave a pretty good description. It scared the hell out of her pretty good. She said the length of a car, quote, a small car. And she said, so I got to see this thing pretty close up of what it looked like. Like I said before, when I worked with Freddie, he was in the back. So he saw his mother and Gene and all the kids up front. Freddie was basically one of the first ones out of there. And his mother told me that she passed most of the boys on the way home running, and she cleared over a fence that was 3 to 4 foot high in one bound. She says, I could have done you
they were
proud.
They were scary.
And all the kids basically were the same thing. They were just all hyped up, and
sure. Yeah, and as a group, you can really get group scare is even worse. You mentioned that some of the kids threw up. Was there any long-lasting effects of what they encountered? Physical effects?
Kathleen said the boys couldn't go to school for a couple of weeks, and she said that I think she said it was Freddie. She said and Eddie, I forget who had worse. They had these dark splotches and blotches all over their skin.
Really?
And one boy was worse than the other. And she said that the doctor, and she even remembered his name, Dr. Bernard Hutchinson in Braxton County, gave the kids some type of antibiotic shots, and they eventually cleared up and went away. But all the boys, including Kathleen, from inhaling this sulfur smell, this gas, their noses were raw. One of the kids, their nose was bleeding, and just a sore throat from breathing that in. And she said Gene was up most of the night vomiting because he was up there close. He got a good whiff of this gas stuff.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we're going into break here in just 3 minutes. But I believe, Frank, you said that it looked like the vehicle was in distress. You said something along those lines. Is that right? Whatever it was that was landing was in some type of distress.
There were many vehicles, to be clear. There were many vehicles that were witnesses being under distress that evening.
I wonder why.
Actually, 4 of them. One came from the southern part of the United States from the direction of Florida, and 3 flew across the eastern seaboard and headed west. One went towards Oak Ridge National Laboratory and penetrated the no-fly zone by about 100 miles. The second one flew northwest and made a beeline directly at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And the third one came over Washington, D.C., and at parts over Washington, it was at treetop level. These things were seen by thousands of people. It wasn't a little isolated thing. And especially back then in 1952, it was hot, really abnormally hot, and there was a lot of people outside. They were driving around their convertibles, walking the dogs or babies in the strollers, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, which was where the hub of the sightings were. People were all outside to cool off a little bit instead of being in the house. It was Friday night, and these people are looking up, and they're seeing this thing and numerous other things flying over the vicinity of Washington.
Wow.
And they were all heading west.
And they're all kind of hyped up on stories of these things darn near landing on the White House lawn.
Absolutely.
That wasn't the same time, though. That was in July, wasn't it, of 52?
That was the summer of saucers. From June forward, it was a madhouse.
Yeah. In July, the end of July is when the sightings and when jet interceptions went out. And then we have this here. I actually worked in reverse. I plotted over 100 points where these UFOs were seen and made crash landings. I have every single location where they touched down and where they were seen and who the witnesses were and their sources. And my timeline brings these 3 damaged objects back off the eastern seaboard. And when all 3 of them came in over the United States, they all had pieces falling off of them. They were on fire. They were making repeated landings. The Flatwoods was the worst condition craft, and that's what the being got out of.
I wonder if he got out with his mechanic's bag of tools. But anyway, it's time for us to go into break right now. So I have a treat for those of you on YouTube and the podcast. It's music by our guest, Alfred Lehmberg, and we're going to play that now. And hang in there at KGRA Radio. We'll be right back right after these messages. All right, welcome back. On with my two guests, Alfred and Frank, and we are talking the FLATWOODS monster case incident, and a lot of things that were actually going on that evening. Hey, thank you for the nice music, Alfred. That was very nice.
Alfred, I was holding my lighter up, but you didn't see it.
Anymore, you're supposed to hold up the light on your cell phone. I understand, and that's what the kids are doing today.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. This case, one thing I do get a lot. I get a lot of feedback from listeners, which I always, for the most part, when it's not too mean, I enjoy it. But one of the things one of the criticisms that I get is, why do you always talk about old cases? And my answer is, because a lot of times new things are found out about these old cases. And can you give me some, for instances, Frank?
Why do the skeptebunkies work so hard to discredit these old cases?
Yeah, that too.
First of all, we had no satellites and no space program back then, so nothing was circling Earth. So that's one of the reasons a couple of the guys I've spoke to over the years says they love these old cases. They can't debunk it by saying it was this, that, or the other. We didn't have anything that I know of rotating around in space. Did we, Al, in 52?
It was 50. Wasn't it 55? Sputnik was, I can't remember what year Sputnik was, but yeah, there's nothing going on then.
Yeah, wasn't that 57?
It might have been. It's thereabouts. Yeah, it was later. And it was, you're right, October 1957 is when Sputnik was up there. So we didn't really have much going on at all, except for, airplanes and such, but definitely nothing on the upper atmosphere. So Frank, since you were on last, have you talked to more people? Have you found out more information over the years since you were here?
Yes, I have. Yeah. I have another book, and I just keep updating everything on the internet. Like I said, every time I do a show, or people just keep contacting me with more stuff. It's overwhelming. It's almost like a full-time job, and it's just piecing everything together. It's a little bit easier now to piece it together because it's basically just filling in the dots. But it was a nightmare at the beginning until I got my time patterns down. But we always have a lot of stuff. I upped the amount of sightings. It's up well over 116 now, documented sightings of where these crafts were seen. And what we were saying earlier before the break, there was actually 4 damaged UFOs. And I had to give them designations. There was the one that flew down towards Tennessee, that was heading towards Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Baltimore. And the one that flew over Washington, which was in Daily News in one of the Boston papers. I think it was a Boston Globe, the flame over Washington. And the bottom line to this whole thing, when I got Project Blue Book and I was reading the information on it, they blamed all of this on a single fireball meteor. All of the sightings throughout the United States. From 1:30 a.m., I have documented till 10:30 p.m., which is 21 hours of sustained sightings. 116. I got a couple more, but I'm not going to change the book now because of that. But there were different objects, different times, and flight paths. And I even broke it down to locations and where these things crash, which the latter part of my book, you can look it up, and I break every single thing down. But these 4 objects that came in over the United States accounted for 13 crash landings, 10 in West Virginia, 2 in Tennessee, and 1 in South Carolina. And that's one of the later cases that I found out information about. And it's basically, like I said before, it's just filling in the gaps. Okay, there it is. Somebody sent me an article, and I dissected the article. And that last one, the South Carolina landing, they said the thing was gigantic. when it went down, which they were. These crafts were like oval shaped. They were like footballs, kind of like spiral and aerodynamic. And that's what landed in Flatwoods. And the rest of them that we're seeing around the United States, they were actually seen making maneuvers. And there was one that's a really cool story. It was in Martins Ferry, Ohio, that this thing actually landed, came across the tower, stopped in midair, and dropped down and landed between them. To give the ending of the story away, but it's fun reading up to. Basically what happened, Flatwoods was a rescue mission. That's why there was thousands of UFO sightings seen that night. There was 3 damaged objects that came in over the eastern seaboard. They went towards each destination. The first one flew down towards the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. The second one flew to Wright Pat. And they were gunning for these areas. The one that flew over 100 miles through the no-fly zone was, if you look at my master map, it was making a beeline and gunning for Oak Ridge. The second one made a beeline for Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. When the third damaged one came across Washington, D.C., when it passed over Washington without getting intercepted, which, can you imagine Harry Truman sitting in the war room going, what the hell do we do now? This thing there's 2 of them headed towards strategic military zones, and the third one's headed right down towards you, Mr. President. What are we going to do? They let that thing fly over Washington, basically at treetop level. That's when it was seen, and it was reported as the flame over Washington. I timed it and figured out the whole pattern of this whole thing. And when that passed immediately over Washington and headed due west, the other 2 objects turned away and went in the opposite direction. The one that was down towards Tennessee headed southeast and turned away and landed a bunch of times throughout Tennessee. The one that turned away from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base turned towards the Wheeling, Ohio County Airport, and it nearly collided with a passenger plane and clipped its wing. There was like about 100 people on board, and they saw this thing flying and almost collided with it. And then it turned and it went south, and it went through the whole state of West Virginia. In the meantime, all these other crafts had come into Flatwoods, and Gray Barker was the first one to report about this. He was pulling his hair out, trying to figure out why there were so many different crafts descriptions given flying throughout Braxton County, and Flatwoods was the hub. If the one that was seen landing on the hill was oval shaped, because when that one thing went down, other ones came in looking for it. And if you read I have a whole chapter that took me years to write. I got all the information from Project Blue Book. When the Flatwoods object flew over Washington, there was about a dozen UFOs that descended down and surrounded the damaged craft like a horseshoe. It's like a runner on a football field when he's breaking away for a touchdown. These things actually surrounded it and followed it west. When it got outside of Washington and a safe zone where it couldn't have been intercepted from the nearby area, they went back up into the sky. That's what took years to figure out. And that's all on the master map. So this was a well-coordinated effort. And I've said this on other shows. I don't claim to have figured this whole thing out. I work with military people for years and years, and I learned a lot. A couple of these guys actually are the ones that looked at my master map back in the day years ago, and they said, "Frank, do you know what the hell you have here?" And I said, "I have some sort of an idea." And one of the guys says, "Give me your drafting board ruler, the one that's like 4 feet long." And he's just started connecting the dots. And he stood back and he went, "Oh my God, I can't believe this." He said, "They think like we do." Or I said, or vice versa. But basically, it's military strategy. It's basically the same. And that's what these things did. When these damaged crafts came in, there were other ones that came in looking for it. And the whole thing was aborted because by the time this the crafts had come in looking. Mrs. May and the kids had seen the thing, and it took off, and they missed the rendezvous point. There was another one that came up from Florida, and I tracked it coming all the way up from the south, and that is a whole ball of wax, the Jones and Del Curto case with the missing jet, where I chased that story around for 10 years. And this one was going up in the Flatwoods too, and they were going to coordinate a landing spot. And my military guys told me, Frank, in battle, you always put your damaged craft near one another to keep them nearby. You don't want to have to go trekking all over the country looking for them. So that's what happened. And what are the chances that the one I tracked from the south going into West Virginia circled over the same damn mountaintop that the other one was at? So 1 billion to 1. So two damaged crafts were up there, but they missed the rendezvous. So everything was aborted. And then that's when they were taken off and they were leaving and they were crashing around the United States. That's the second half of the story. And that's where I have all these locations in my book where they were seen.
A downed pilot rescue operation.
If you just read Blue Book, they didn't have all the states. I got the rest of the states and the information through the newspaper articles.
A downed
go
alien
ahead.
pilot rescue operation is the short version, for people who might be losing track on all this.
So the information that you try to put all this together, Frank, and what were the other sources? You said there were military, but when you talk about these craft being in a horseshoe shape and and as geographically around it, are these from like multiple witnesses and things like that? I mean, how did you get this? I know you said you worked many years in this, and I'm just wondering how you came across this information, were able to verify things. And
tentative observers questionnaires, where people would witness something. They would contact the Air Force and they would tell them they had a UFO sighting, and Air Force would send them this long paper to fill out. And that most of that was in Blue Book. Then when I started, because it was so wide of an area that this happened, once I found out in Blue Book of where the sightings were, I started looking through some of the papers and local papers. And all the Baltimore papers, the Virginia papers, D.C., Pennsylvania. And that's why it took so many years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to put this damn thing together, is because once I got started, I couldn't stop. And then people started helping me, and they said, wow, this guy's onto something. And then Stanton Friedman jumped on board, and Stanton was getting me information. I needed Harry Truman's telephone memorandum for September 12th and 13th, 1952, and I got it run around like you wouldn't believe. I told Stanton a week later I had him. Stanton made a phone call and I got him in the mail.
Yeah, is that right?
So, it's just, there's so much information. But like I said earlier, the reason that this thing took so long is going through all of these tentative observers questionnaires from the public, and you have to decipher and break it down. The hardest part was re-inking everything. I had to magnify some of the pages, the 8x10 pages, to 2, 3, 4 feet big, just to figure out what the word said. And then once I figured this out, it took years of piecing it together. Then all the newspaper articles.
Is that through microfiche or something?
Whole tri-state area, and it's just piecing it all together. And when you start seeing a pattern develop, and what I actually did, Martin, is, because I'm an illustrator, just because there was a lot of sightings doesn't mean there was a lot of different objects, because I saw a lot of connections between what was reported in the paper and the times, dates, and locations. And then I would find somebody reported it to Blue Book. So I actually took all the descriptions and did thumbnail drawings. And then I did dozens of paintings of UFOs, like the ones that you have, I saw on your website. I have dozens of those. And each one is a different shape. And I would write on the back where it was seen, what time of location, color, size, trajectory. And my house looked like a museum. and all of this stuff was lined up all over the house. And my mom helped me with some of this work because I was pulling my hair out. And sometimes in the middle of the night, she would yell, "Oh, I figured something out." And I would get up and I would look over, and this one was seen here, here, and there. Because when you look at the same stuff over for 5, 10 years in a row, and it just started falling into place like a jigsaw puzzle. And then when Stanton came on board, Stanton gave me more information. I actually had to restructure my book and stop working on it. It was about ready to go out. And I had to stop for a year because the Barry Greenwood collection, Stanton got his hands on that. And he sent me more newspaper articles. And I remember that day when it came in the mail, this big giant box. I'm like, oh my God, here we go. And it was like pounds of paper from the Greenwood collection. So that's more information. And so basically it's just piecing it all together. And here I am. I just told Alfred this afternoon, 30 years I've been doing this. I started in 1991. Yeah, 30 years. Wow. And we could do 100 shows. We could do a mini series for a month and not even touch on everything. There's so much that happened that night.
Right. I wanted to let you know that I usually take screen calls, but because the way we had to contact you, our phone line is being occupied. So, but what I am going to do though is I'm going to say to the people that are in the chat on YouTube and Facebook and Twitch, any of those people, if you want to ask our guests, either one of our guests, any questions, please put it in all caps. And I will ask the questions. We'll take a look at them first, but I'll ask reasonable questions. So just remember to put it in caps so I don't miss it. And because we do have people that probably have asked questions, earlier on that I missed, but I'll keep my eyes on it now.
Talking about the monster earlier, Martin, is when Freddie was talking about the description of it. He said the eyes were portholes and they weren't red like press portrayed bulging red eyes. He said that was hype. And he told me later on, what happened is when this monster lit up, it lit up from the inside. And Mrs. May told me that it was basically in a dormant, it was dormant sitting there, and it was like kind of hovering a little bit. And when they saw the eyes, it's when they hit the beams of the flashlights hit it. That's when the thing lit up, and it forced light from the inside out. And years later, Freddie told me, he said, you know what it was like? It was like when you get in your car at night and it's dark and you put your key in the ignition and you start your key up and the whole inside of the dashboard lights up and throws light all over the place. He said that's what it was like. And I remember standing inside the gully where he told me where he saw the tracks the following day when he was a kid. And he said this thing was definitely being controlled. He said, Frank, there was something inside of it, the way this thing reacted to us. And then I started researching a little bit further, and I found an article that had a story in it from 1955, and it happened about 17 miles away, and it involved George Snitowski and his wife and the baby. And that's the thing that Alfred and I did Monster Quest with, which basically they focused on the Snitowski Frametown monster. And what I did is I was getting all the local papers and maps in Braxton County, and basically I used hunting maps because that's a big hunting area up there. So I got old newspaper articles that were kicking around and laying around. The Gray Barker Museum had some. The Braxton County Library had some old articles. And I actually tracked and followed the path of the Flatwoods monster craft after it left the farm. And I remember talking with Stanton Friedman, and he said, Frank, do you see what these things were doing? And I didn't know what he was getting at. They were following rivers and streets. And I'll never forget Stanton said, he said, Frank, when our boys were in World War II and they were in foreign lands. If you didn't want to get too lost, you would follow the rivers. And that's what these things did. They followed the rivers and they followed the roads. And I followed the Flatwoods craft for 17 miles after it landed Flatwoods, and it followed the Elk River in an east-southeast pattern and away from the farm. And it eventually touched down and landed in Frametown. And that's where the story of the Frametown monster occurred, where George Snatowski's car mysteriously shut off. There was a UFO seen hovering out in the woods, and the whole electrical system died on his car. And that's when Alfred and we were up there and we did that Monster Quench segment. And that's what it was. When George Snatowski got out of his car, he checked, he had a brand new battery, and he opened up the hood and he was checking out the battery in the car, but the electrical system was down. And there was once again this horrible smell, like what Freddie described. And it was coming from off to the side of the road towards the woods, and it was rolling, and it was that smoke, same exact thing. And what was seen at Flatwoods the night before. And George started walking out towards the area of the woods, and he saw this thing pulsing out in the woods, and it was like a violet color. And it was, he said it looked like a phosphorus glow, and it was like intermittently getting brighter, then it would get dull. And as he started walking towards this thing, he threw up from the smell of the sulfur coming in the other direction. And long story short, his wife, Edith, started screaming bloody murder like Fay Ray when she saw King Kong on Skull Island. He turned around and he looked behind him, and he saw this thing about 9 foot tall hovering towards him. And from the waist up, he saw the torso and this large head with long spindly arms with forked fingers at the end. And the bottom half of it was mechanical, and it was hovering towards him. Well, he turned around and hightailed it back to the car. The baby's inside going hysterical. You can imagine the scene. And he's inside. He grabbed a knife, a hunting knife that he had in the glove box. Now, these are early 50s cars, so there was a lot of room in them, What he did, basically, he pushed his wife down under the passenger dashboard, and he hovered over. She had grabbed the baby from the back seat. There was no baby seats back then. What it was basically a crib, a miniature crib, and he huddled over. This thing had over his family, protecting him with the knife. This thing hovered around the car, engulfed it with this that rancid smell, and it actually unbeknownst to him, he peeked his head up to see where the hell this thing was. And when he lifted his head over the dashboard, the thing was looking down at him through the windshield. Now, I spoke to George Snatowski, and he explained a little bit of what this thing looked like. I found the main part of the article in an adventure magazine. They were men's magazines back in the day, and it was called Mail, hunting and fishing and all that type of stuff. And I tracked that actual magazine down, and it's weird. I've talked about this with Alfred. It's over the years, whenever I would see the need something that would pop up. I found this in the early 90s before all the internet and stuff and everything. I went to a big collectible and comic book show, and a guy from New Jersey came down to Orlando, and I says, I'm looking for the July 1955 magazine of Mail. And he had hundreds of boxes of magazines. That was a specialty. And he says, I probably don't have it because 9 out of 10 people that asked for it don't have it. And he says, look over in this box. And I pulled the thing out. I almost had a heart attack because there was not a lot known about this. Just a few little words here and there, a few sentences. But I got the full-blown article. So I reviewed it, picked it apart, had all the information. And I sent George Snatowski a packet. He was living in Queens, New York at the time. And then I called him and I spoke to him on the phone. He didn't want to go public with it. He said because of his work and what he was involved with, he says, I went through hell with this thing once before. All I wanted to know is what this thing looked like and was this true? And basically, he said that interview that he did in 1955, the guy's name was Paul Lieb, L-I-E-B. He says everything was the truth. He said that's how it happened. And basically, this thing was some type of a snake-looking reptilian creature. And he saw it from the waist up. And he said it was about a good 9 foot tall. And from the witnesses, from their descriptions in Flatwoods, and when Colonel Levitt, who was up there that night, Levitt told me the tree that this thing passed under was about 12 feet tall. So I'm putting all this information together and looking at the original articles. So if you have something that's 9 foot tall and you put a suit over the top of it, it's going to be about 12 feet tall. And that's what Colonel Levitt told me. He stood there when I interviewed him on site, and he said that thing passed right under there. And he said down under here is where all the oil was. He said there wasn't a lot of clearance when it came out. He says it just barely cleared that branch. And that's when I put all the pieces together. And what happened is when Snatowski looked up over the windshield and this thing was staring down at him, it put its hand down on the hood and burnt through the paint. And lifted his hand back up, and he ducked back down, and the thing took off and went into the woods. And a few minutes later, George looked back up and he saw the object out in the distance. It lifted up. And Martin, you probably have read about this, how these things, sometimes they go in a pendulum motion, and it was rocking back and forth like a pendulum, going from left to right, an arc, and all of a sudden it took off like a bat out of hell and just disappeared. And then after it disappeared, the car started up again.
You know, just with regard, if I may, with regard to monsters and all this talk of monsters and everything, we should notice that this thing showed remarkable restraint for likely having been shot down.
Absolutely. A lot of people have brought that up to me, Al. You're right. Yeah, didn't make any motions towards any of them in Flatwoods or here. And then I have another witness who came forward, and he saw this thing over in the area of Strange Creek. He saw it with the helmet off, but it still had the upper torso on and the lower torso. So it seems along its path here, Alfred, as it was puddle jumping through Braxton County, it was taking pieces of its armor off of its spacesuit.
Wow. Strange stuff. We have a bunch of questions.
You know what? And like I said, being an illustrator, I was able to talk with these people, do drawings, and I was driving them crazy. Sometimes I was sending stuff up Fed Express back and forth to West Virginia and all over the country. Whoever came forward, I'm like, does it look like this and that and this and that? And then they would do their changes, send me back everything. So I went from my thumbnail sketches to comprehensive sketches to drawings to paintings. And what we have now is about as close as I think we're ever going to get to it, of what I portrayed in my illustrations.
So we do have some questions that came up in chat, and the first one I think you more or less addressed. Philip wanted to know any idea where the crashed craft were taken, but nothing was left on the ground. Is that right? As far as you know,
as far as I know, they all left out of the southern part of the United States.
Yeah. Okay. Here's another question here. How long was it from start of the investigation to wrapped up on the scene? And then second part of the question, were there any Men in Black visits reported?
The Men in Black were the guys from Washington who Kathleen May told me they posed as newspaper reporters.
Oh, I see. Yeah. You said that earlier. Right.
And yeah, and that's when she was kind of blowing them off in plain English. She didn't want to be bothered with them. And finally, and they came back again, and they were being a pain in the neck, and they finally told her, you know, we're from Washington, D.C., where we got to ask you more questions, and those are the guys that took the oil. And then as far as Ailey Stewart, when he had that chunk of metal, and his father and everybody in town were nervous because he was showing it to everybody and talking it up, they took a gasoline blowtorch and they put it in a clamp at the local garage, and the thing wouldn't burn. And that's what made everybody nervous. And then Stewart said that there was a couple people that came in from Washington, and they claimed they were with the Treasury Department. And what was weird about this is Stewart said they were able to take a pair of tin snips and cut this stuff.
What stuff?
But it was
not the oil.
There was a piece of metal. It looked like drip solder. If you put your forefinger and your thumb together and make like a circular oval, Stewart said it was about that big and it was flat. And he said it looked like drip solder. Like the edges of it were like, you know, like an octopus. They melted out and like globs. And he says it wouldn't burn with a gasoline blowtorch, but they were able to snip it because it was thin, but it wouldn't burn. And he said that when these people came, he said they were from the Treasury Department. He said they gave their names and contact numbers and all that kind of stuff. And he said he went to work at the Democrat, and when he came back home, his house had been broken into, and quote unquote, he said the balance of the metal was gone. So his house was broken into when he was at work, and they took the rest of it. And this was just right before he was getting ready to go to New York on national television and bring that metal with him.
Wow. So the first part of that question wasn't answered yet. Hold on, Alfred, just a second. How long was it from the start of the investigation to when they wrapped up on the scene?
Whose investigation?
Well, you did say that it was investigated by Sanders.
From Washington? Yeah, they came in on one day. They talked to Kathleen, talked to some of the locals, and then they came back the following day, and then they left. So they were there over a period of 2 days.
Yeah, okay. Alfred, were you about ready to say something?
No, sir. No, sir.
Okay. All right, another question here. It sounds like someone wants your opinion, and as your, I'm trying to read how, as your guest is saying, the aliens think like us. What were they doing on Earth? Why haven't they invaded us? You know, this is a question that you hear from someone that a lot of times you hear from someone that's just starting to look into this topic. So just your opinion here. Either one of you can go with that.
Well, the thing about invading us is we don't have any context for that. We have a lot of evidence indicating that some of these things are occurring, and if you put all of this together, especially coming back to that military angle that I was talking about before, it seems that as of late the military is investigating and interested in UFOs. And isn't there going to be some kind of information dump before the end of June or something? Maybe you have some information on that I don't have.
But the 180-day thing. Yeah, we may know something. We don't know for sure what will be told by this investigation, this government investigation.
But we certainly can't answer the question, why haven't they invaded us? Because we don't have any idea why. All we can say distinctly is that they are in evidence, have been in evidence, they are not going away, and continue to be in evidence.
Yeah, well said. Yeah.
Here's about they think like us. That was a military point of view at one of the Air Force guys I work with that rescue mission. And when he stood back and he looked at my master map and he says, "Frank, do you know what the hell you have here?" I said, "I have some kind of an idea." And that's when he said, "They think like us." or we think like them, whatever way you want to say it, because basic military strategy is search and rescue. And he says, this is how we do stuff like that. Alfred was a Vietnam vet. He fought. How many $1,000 of combat did you fly, Alfred? Alfred knows about this better than anybody. He actually fired the 2.75-inch Mighty Mouse rockets that the Air Force was shooting at the flying saucers in 52. Like I said, Al Lehmberg knows better than anybody.
Well, I wish I had something to add to that, but I don't.
Here's another question. And I believe you answered this, Frank. Did you say that the creature looked reptilian under the suit? But you said almost like serpentine, right?
Yeah. It had like a big elongated head and long spindly arms. They were like disjointed. They were very skinny, and they went into forked fingers. And Satowski told me when the thing reached across the hood, he got to see it up close. He was scared out of his mind. And so he saw this thing up close, and it was it was dark. It was dark in color and looked like snake-like, like serpent. So from doing my drawings and drawing this monster for, what seemed like a million years, and looking at this thing and talking to people, I have illustrations on my website and in my book. And I was flipping through books about snakes and stuff, and I saw one coiled up in one of these reference books I was looking through. I went, holy cow, look at this thing, the way it's coiled up. And I took a tissue overlay and I went over the top of it, and I said, son of a gun, look at that. That's the way that the lower torso's flared out. Like if something was coiled up and sitting inside of it. Do you understand what I mean? A snake coiled up? And then it center towards the top. And I went, oh my God, no wonder this thing was flared out. Now it's starting to make sense. And when Snatowski saw this thing, he saw it just from the waist up, and he smelled that sulfur, and he saw that purplish flash and the pulsing. And Mrs. May also told me that. She said when she was walking up onto the Fisher farm with the boys before they hit the first crest of the hill, she said, we saw a big, gigantic purple flash come from the back of the farm. So you have the purple hues and the flashes that happen when both of these things touch down in both cases. You have the monster with the lower torso of it with the pipes going around, and it was a machine from the waist down, and nobody could figure out why. And that's when I came up and I says, wow, this thing was wearing a suit. And Freddie May kept telling me over and over up on the site, and Mrs. May did too, how this thing reacted to him. And Freddie said to me, he said, Frank, there was something inside that thing, the way it looked, the way it reacted, and the way it was hovering around controlled. I don't believe it was a robot, because after the Santowski thing, the following night, and then I had another guy contact me. He was a little boy, and he saw it in Strange Creek. He was looking out of his bedroom window. He heard something outside, and he looked out, and he saw this thing about 10 foot tall hovering down his driveway. And it turned around, it came up towards his carport, and he actually read my book, and he contacted me. And he said, Frank, he says, you have the illustrations of it partway out of the suit. In Frametown, it was all the way in its suit. He says, when I saw it with just the helmet off. He said, but I saw the torso area in the lower part. So, we have all these different descriptions. So it seems like this thing was taking parts of its spacesuit off.
Probably hot or something.
It was damaged, and, when it was hot, maybe that's why it was taking it off. I don't know. We may never know. We just have
Hobbs, we have. Go ahead. All right. Hobbs over on Facebook had a question. And what's the theory as to why so many craft were damaged? Had they been intercepted?
That's what we're going by right now. that.
And you're talking military. I think Alfred alluded to that.
They were shot down. Alfred, you want to talk a little bit about that?
I really don't have anything large to say about it, except for the fact that that's every indication. I mean, you have summer saucers, they're impinging on prohibited airspace. There are orders to shoot them down. I think the next obvious thing is that some of them were shot down, and there's evidence of that. So what can I tell you? Yes, they were intercepted. Yes,
and
there was.
You have the pilots down in Florida who disappeared, and I spent years on that too. And the Air Force busted them off on me over that. The pilot and co-pilot, Second Lieutenant John Anderson Jones Jr. and John Del Curto, they were at Tyndall Air Force Base, and they were being tracked by several radars throughout the Gulf of Mexico, and they vanished into thin air 70 miles off the coast. It took me 5 years just to put it together. Then when Stanton got the documents, when they came out, I spent several more years, and I know every move that jet made, and it was a complete cover-up. The Air Force had no record of the men being born. Social Security death index had nothing. There was nothing in the archives. Nothing on planet Earth had any record of these men being alive. When my first book came out, and I came out with some of the evidence in 2004, a few months later, then miraculously the Air Force released all the information. And then I took all the information I had and I put it all together. We talked on your last show about that a little bit, but there was a lot of stuff that went down that night. The September 12th accident aircraft reports were pulled, and there's some missing. And that's a whole other show in itself. But anyways, back then, the Air Force and Navy had rocket-bearing craft. We had the F-94C Starfire, the F-86D, Sabre Dog, and the F-7U-3 Cutlass, and they all had Mighty Mouse rockets on them. And what I used to talk with Stanton about and what he liked is, boy, wouldn't that be a surprise? One day you're firing bullets at him, and next day there's craft coming 600 to 700 miles shooting rockets at them. And
wow.
From all the objects being damaged, that's the conclusion we came to, because they all came in over the United States damaged.
And someone may ask the question, how is it that we can shoot down extraterrestrials with their technology? And all I can tell you is that 10 pounds of high explosive arriving at the speed of sound has got to complicate your physics.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. We have Janice over at Facebook asked this question: is there any other time period where there's something similar to this has occurred, or has something similar happened currently? Either one of you aware of?
Not to this magnitude. It's funny. I asked Stanton that question a few years ago before he went on there to do a radio show, and he said, Frank, he said, there's nothing that's documented to the extent of this. He said this was a full-blown night. Nobody's ever done anything like this. And I don't think there's anything else, Martin, after this case that had this amount of sightings in one day, is there?
This is the only story that is UFO story, in my knowledge, that has gone completely soup to nuts.
Yeah. It's really amazing. I mean, there's so much more to this than I remembered us ever talking about in the past. You know?
One more time?
I said there's so much more to this than I remember knowing or talking about, in the past. There's so much more to this sighting than, I'm just thinking of.
The government said it was a meteor, a fireball meteor.
Yeah.
And it was not a meteor, because when the thing passed over Washington, Stanton had calculated it for me. When it took a half an hour for it to once it passed over Washington, if it was a fireball meteor, the speed it was traveling, it would have landed in Flatwoods in a few seconds. It took half an hour, so it was traveling approximately somewhere between 200 to 400 miles an hour, because it wasn't constant. But it definitely was a meteor. It would have been seconds.
Absolutely. 42,000 miles an hour or something like that.
Wasn't it Stanton Friedman who also pointed out that if a meteor had landed in Flatwoods, it would have been flattened woods?
Yeah.
That sounds like something he would have said.
Walking around the grounds.
Right.
Project Blue Book record card. The officials said the West Virginia monster, so-called, actually the object was the well-known Washington area meteor of 12 September landing near Flatwoods. Have confirmation in Astronomy Club from Akron, Ohio. And they say landing near Flatwoods. There would have been no Flatwoods left if that thing was a meteor.
Yeah, for that size. Someone wanted to know, Frank, where someone can see a comprehensive book with illustrations. I mean, are your books filled with your own illustrations?
There's hundreds of them.
And where someone can just find that on your website. We haven't given out your website yet, so if you'd like to.
Yeah, and there's also color pictures and all my illustrations on my website. If you just put in Frank Feschino Flatwoods Monster on a search engine and hit images, you'll see them all.
And look for that. I was just going to say, look for that 40-minute documentary that Frank produced too. That's a real eye opener.
Oh, great. Okay, and that's on
YouTube. Braxton County Monster, book by Feschino. What I did there is I had, 20 to 25 years of cutaway shots and illustrations I had worked on, and I worked with a couple friends of mine, and they put this whole thing together. I basically wrote it and narrated it, and my buddy's is retired, and he sat down with me for months. I thought it was going to be a couple-week project. Boy, was I wrong. We ended up working on it for months, because every time I could see what he could do on the computer, I was like a little kid sitting there in the chair going, wow, you can do this, you could do that. And he was doing it. So my script changed like 100 times over, and you'll see the result of it on YouTube. And it's pretty cool. It was put together well. And it kind of pulls everything together that I was talking about tonight in 40 minutes. And the book tells the rest. Like I have snippets of Colonel Levitt with Freddie May, with the different witnesses, the different locations where it happened. And then once you read the book, it's the full-blown information in there. I would suggest watching the YouTube documentary first, because you get a feel of the people in the area, of what everything was like, and you know what the people were like. You see Colonel Levitt, Mrs. May, all the witnesses. You see the tree, the different areas throughout Flatwoods that I documented. Then when you're reading the book, you have that image in your head of what it was really like back in the day. And it's amazing how it's changed in 30 years up there.
Oh, yeah, everything has.
I got some good footage and stuff up there from the early 90s before everything really changed.
I know I asked you this question, but there's been more than one person asking the same question that I asked you previously, and that is, did the people affected from the sulfur type smell have any health issues later in life, possibly from this?
Some of the witnesses had cancer. But
I see. Later in life. That I didn't ask that particular way. Yeah. Okay. So they did. Wow.
And we may never know, but some of them had lung problems
related
and throat cancer, and God only knows. But who knows? The way that they described how sick they were and inhaled everything.
Yeah. Another question that's popped up in two different places. Point Pleasant, is that anywhere near Flatwoods? Was there any type of, I know that's a Mothman sighting, totally different thing, but was there any type of crossover or a connection between the two?
Not in Point Pleasant. That stuff was basically in 1967.
Yeah, I know it was many years later.
There were sightings throughout that whole area of the United States, because there was actually a second rescue mission, which we could do another show on. There was another alien that was found in the Wheeling area. Remember when I said earlier one almost crashed and hit a passenger plane? And
yes, clipped the wing
at the airport. One crash landed there, and the cover story was the locals in this area where they found a body, and they said it was a body of a badly burned woman. Well, I researched, and there was no deaths or any badly burned woman up there that was found in that time frame. And then there were reports of a monster that was seen in that area. And, you know, that's a whole other show within itself. But the craft that had flown over Washington earlier, when the Flatwoods craft went west and traveled 206 miles, went across Front Royal, Virginia, went across Elkins, West Virginia, went into Burnsville. When that passed and landed, there was the other one that had turned away that crashed in the Wheeling area. All of those crafts that were in the DC, Virginia, Maryland area actually lifted up. They went northwest, and they went looking for the second one. And there is unbelievable amounts of evidence. There was like thousands of sightings of people watching these things come down out of the sky. They called it a meteor shower. That's how many of them there were. And they were looking for that one there. So this whole night, that's why it took about 25 years to put this together. It was just amazing. And like I said, I was able to have all my paintings and say, wow, this one was seen here, this one was seen here and here and here and there. And then I got newspaper articles from the Wheeling area. Then I got newspaper articles from down in the Tennessee area. And it's just extracting all the information out and putting them on a big chart. And then I would do more paintings, line them up on the wall and put the timelines together. And like I said earlier, and then that's when I thought I had everything together, and Stanton sent me this big gigantic box with the Greenwood collection. And there were more articles that nobody had ever seen. So what I did is I just would go in and extract the information out of there, go back to my master map and plot the points. That's why.
Okay, just to let you know, we got about 2.5 minutes. Just hang on just a second. Just want to let you know we have 2.5 minutes, and someone is looking right now, trying to find your YouTube channel and the documentary, and just if you could give that out, just so everybody can find that.
It's if you go to flatwoodsmonster.com, it's right on my website.
Oh, there you go. That's a good way to find it.
Straight to YouTube, or if you keywords in Braxton County Monster book by Feschino, it'll come up. But everything is off my website.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So you heard it there. flatwoodsmonster.com. Is that what it is?
That's it.
Yeah. Okay. So that was a question asked quite a bit, and we just have like a minute and a half. Albert, I heard you start to say something.
No, I don't know what I'm doing over here to make you think that, but no. What I was looking for was a site. Was looking for the YouTube site address that I could publish to you, and then maybe you could pass it on to people.
Yeah. Okay.
Looking for right now.
All right. Well, that's okay. We're really out of time, but I want to thank you both, and it's been a real pleasure. A lot of fun tonight. Thank you very much.
I enjoyed it, and thank you so much for the external validation on my music. That was real nice.
Oh, yeah, it's great. All right, thank you both very much.
Thank you. Good night.
Hasta la vista.
Good night now. All right. So we'll be back. We'll be back next week with Ralph Blumenthal. So that should be a really good show. Same time next week. And thank you so much for watching, listening, however you're participating. Thanks for your questions in chat. Sorry we couldn't have phone, but again, we will have that all back next week with Ralph Blumenthal. And so we'll see you next week. And remember to keep your eyes to the sky.